A lot of these things like collaging and embroidery and knitting and all of these things were always seen as sort of women's work. And whenever people think about craft or like DIY, it's always seen as like this thing that kind of like twee women do. I don't know, it's not given the same kind of respect as like traditional oil painting that like, you know, traditionally male artists do. And there is something really nice about reclaiming that and like actually just making fine art using all of these elements. My name is Rithika Merchant. I'm a visual artist from Mumbai. I've always been really creatively inclined, and I always did it as a hobby. Like as a child, I always liked to color. I always gravitated much more to like the arts and the crafts, and I always liked doing that kind of stuff. And I think I pretty much always knew I'd do something creative since I was really, really little. I love craft, and it's actually like a part of my practice even now, especially like collaging and things like that. But even as a child and as a teen, I love things like block printing. Like I still love Indian block printing. There's like a huge part of Indian craft like embroidery and like, as I said, block printing. And like there's so many different types of weaving and all of these different things that you can do with your hands that I really, really love and also loved from a young age. And the craft aspect of it, and also making these paintings that almost in some ways look a little bit kind of crafty and look a little bit like fabric, and like folding the pieces and kind of making them look like quilts, sort of is a bit of a nod to the fact that I have always liked doing that. And I always loved doing things with my hands. Like even as a child, like I always loved things like origami, and I loved to knit, and I'm making myself sound like I'm 100 years old right now, being like, I loved to knit when I was like 13 years old. But I did, you know, I always liked doing things with my hands and like just creating things. And yeah, I mean, I've always kind of just been into that kind of stuff. One of the reasons I use collage in my work, and especially like all of these old magazine cutouts, and I hand make all of the borders that you see on my work. And I mean, there's no works like this in this current show, but I also do works in embroidery hoops. And there's an element of that which a lot of these things like collaging and embroidery and knitting and all of these things were always seen as sort of women's work. And there was something nice about reclaiming these. Because when I was in school, I remember, because again, it was a very conceptual school, people did look down their nose a little bit at the craft aspect of things. Like whenever people think about craft or like DIY, it's always seen as like this thing that kind of like twee women do. I don't know, it's not given the same kind of respect as like traditional oil painting that like, you know, traditionally male artists do. And there is something really nice about reclaiming that and like actually just making fine art using all of these elements. And it's a big part of my work now. Like I started with embroidery hoops, and then I slowly started adding collage into it. And over time, it's like taken up more and more space in my practice. And I also see like even within the wider movement, like a lot of other female artists are working with craft as well. And it's really nice to see, you know, it's nice to see the tides kind of turning, and these like amazing trades, I guess. I mean, I don't know what the correct word is. These trades or these practices, like kind of getting the respect that they deserve now, because so much of our cultural history, like if you look at old tapestries and things like that, they tell you so much about a culture, and it's nice to be using elements of that in my work now and also seeing other artists do it as well. I didn't actually start with folding my work. I started with cutting my work. It was, so after I graduated college, I went to do an artist residency in Portugal, after which I moved to Lisbon for like a couple of months. Actually, it was almost a year that I was there. But I had a really, really tiny room, and I didn't have a studio. And I had this small little desk. And at the same time, like while I was there, I kept seeing all of these azulejos, which are the Portuguese style murals. And they were these like sectioned off like beautiful murals that told these like amazing narrative stories. And I was really inspired by that, and I thought it would be also an interesting way to kind of translate that into my work. And because I had such limited space, I thought that making sort of these paper tiles would be a good way to sort of make larger pieces. So I started that way, and the pieces were actually sort of cut, and then I would eventually like mount them together onto like another sheet of paper to exhibit them. But over time, it kind of evolved, and the cuts kind of turned into folds. And then the folds started to become more and more elaborate. And as I started folding the paper, I loved the texture it gave the paper. And the folds are almost like, I call them like the scaffolding or like the bones of my painting. Like I almost build the works on top of them. And I use them for color blocking, and I use them to inform the composition. So like, say if I want to draw attention to like one part of the piece, I'll kind of do a fold like this and maybe have different folds on there because they're not always symmetrical. And they kind of, they just became this way for me to build, just add another layer to the work and almost make, because when you do works on paper, the paper is kind of an afterthought, but sort of making the paper have this texture and giving it these folds, it almost made the paper part of the narrative as well. And it was just this very all-encompassing way to use the medium. I don't think I'll ever stop folding my paintings, actually. A big part of my painting process, which I don't know if a lot of people know that I do, but I essentially put like a yellow ochre wash over almost every color that I use. So the blues will never be the blue that comes out of the tube. Almost everything is at least 2 or 3 colors layered one over the other. So I always try to sort of bring out the warmth in the colors, because there's something about that which makes me think of like old maps and old botanical drawings, and even these old illustrated books. They were always, well, either they were just like black and white, or they were very warm, or maybe in my mind they were warm because the paper kind of yellowed over time. But that's sort of what I associate with it, and it's something that I've brought into my own work as well. With the paper being part of the narrative, and now like the paint and the tint, like every aspect of it, even though it's a work on paper, like even the materials are kind of part of the narrative of the piece. So it's all one all-encompassing thing. It's not just the painting that you see. 2 or 3 years after I graduated, I read Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, which is like a really iconic book that I feel like most people have read. And that kind of really made me think about the power of stories and storytelling, and mostly comparative mythology. It's what sort of made me interested in that. And that's sort of where I started. I mean, it really was in a direct response to reading that book that this like mega interest in myths kind of began. But I mean, the storytelling, the historical aspects, I think have always been something that I was interested in. Even when I was in Greece, I was very interested in all of that. And just through traveling, it's like I've always loved going to museums and like learning about the artifacts and how objects tell you about a certain culture, and like the stories behind them. I've always found that really, really interesting. And I think you see that in my work as well. And it's something that I reference even to this day. I feel like I always will. Having lived in Europe for some of the time and like being married to someone from here, and I've always kind of felt very connected to India as well. And there were definitely times in my life where I kind of felt like I belonged in neither and belonged in both. And I think that's really common for people. Like I don't think it's a unique experience that I had. A lot of people who live in between 2 different places feel that way. But I remember at the time reading about all of these myths, and especially like looking at comparative mythology and seeing that you see the same myth in different cultures almost made me feel sort of less alone in a way. Like it was like this mythical like cord of like unanimity that like tied all of these different cultures together. And I was like, well, everyone actually does kind of view things the same way. And especially when you look at like myths and rituals, it's really obvious that these were reactions to making sense of the world around them. And I mean, the really primitive myths are a response to just natural phenomena and trying to figure out, give some sort of meaning to like why there's lightning, or why there are floods, or why there are earthquakes. And when you look at these myths, you see that we all think the same way. And it makes sense when you think about evolution, because we all kind of evolved the same way. So even if you ended up on different continents, it would make sense that like some of the really, really early myths are the same. But what's more interesting to me is the later myths, which are also very similar. And I think that is a testament to the fact that we all do think very similarly. I had a show in 2020 during the pandemic in India called Birth of a New World. And it was kind of a response to sort of the ecological crisis we're going through and how essentially we're ruining the planet that we're on. But it was called Birth of a New World, and ultimately it was a hopeful show. And I explored, as I said, these like ecological themes. And then, so this show currently on view at Gallery LJ is a continuation of those works, but I'm sort of more looking to the future now. And these works are kind of more inspired a little bit by science fiction. The overarching theme is the sun and the power of the sun and how we can kind of use that to sort of forge a better path for ourselves. So like, I've invented this kind of cult of the sun that is, they've learned everything from the past. And so I've like looked at like I've got alchemical references, I've got mythological references. So it's like they've assimilated all of this information, and now they're kind of going to use it to sort of build a better future using the power of the sun, because it's the only power source that we have. I'm making it sound really dire because we are in this like time of crisis when it comes to the planet, but the show ultimately is quite hopeful. Like the themes are like, we can find utopia essentially. They're not illustrations of specific myths. It's just like I like read a lot about all of these different things, and I looked at how all of these different ancient cultures had like viewed the sun and the stories they sort of told about the sun, and I sort of tried to like use those stories in a more contemporary way while telling my own stories. There isn't a cult of the sun in India the way like the Egyptians had, for example, but sun worship, I think it exists in every single culture. You know, there are temples to the sun everywhere. One of the newer figures that you'll see in this show as well as like just the last show is the blue figure with the eye for a head. And he's sort of this observer figure. I feel like he transcends time. He's like both from the past and from the future. And he's always kind of there to sort of steer you along the right path. And yeah, he's sort of this sort of kind of almost divine being. The rest of the figures are meant to be us, and I've always made the figures half animal, half human, because I've wanted them to be sort of free of gender and free of ethnicity and free of any kind of like cultural signifier, so that almost anyone can inhabit them. And then we have sort of this observer figure that is also sort of it's a higher version of us. Across the board, people have responded to the work quite similarly. And I think it's because the themes are quite universal. I don't think it's something that's super specific to a culture. And so I haven't actually seen that much of a difference of reaction the way you would think. But I think, again, because we are dealing with universal themes, and I think in some ways people can relate to the work wherever they're from, they have reacted in a way, in a pretty sort of similar way. I think we'll always tell stories, and we'll always try to find a way to like grapple with what's going on. I mean, that's what art is. I mean, that's what my art is, you know, it's a reaction to what's going on in the world. And I like to think that what I'm doing is contemporary myth making, and trying to find a path to like the future in some way, or make sense of what's going on around me. And yeah, I mean, when I really think about it, I do think artists and writers are contemporary myth makers, because that's what we do, you know.